This is our digital church. You are all welcome here. Let us join with the prophet Jeremiah in our community's call to worship. As we search for a place of rest, the Lord appeared to us from a distance. I have loved you with a love that lasts forever. And so, with unfailing love, I have drawn you to myself. I will build you up, and you will be rebuilt. You will play your tambourines and dance with joy. You will plant vineyards that produce the fruit of the vine. Farmers will plant and then enjoy the harvest. The time will come when the watchmen shout from the highlands, "Get ready, heaven is coming. Get ready for the Lord our God." Blessed be God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, and blessed be God's kingdom, now and forever. Amen. Let us come before the Lord with a spirit of thanksgiving and lift up our hearts in adoration. We gather in the name of Jesus Christ, who calls us to follow in the way of love. May the Holy Spirit guide us in our lives and draw us closer to God's holy presence. Let us offer our prayers and petitions to the Lord. May this time of worship be a source of strength and renewal.
In a land where prophets are killed, where God is crucified over and over again, where people abandon each other for the sake of ideas, making enemies of sisters and brothers, fighting wars because of fear, because of figments of our imagination, the war of terror within us, tearing at the bonds that join us. God is still with us, among us, Emmanuel, who is with the demonized and disenfranchised, the outcasts and other, to bring them together as a mother hen, desiring to gather her brood, to keep them safe from foxes who seek to kill, steal, and destroy, holding them close into her chest. If we chose to listen to her heart and be comforted by the warmth of her wings, if we choose the care that promises to never leave us, never to abandon us to ourselves, God abiding in love and loyalty, God ever present.
Please join me in a prayer of unity. You are all welcome at the table of God, every person, adult and child, for Christ brings peace to all, tearing down every hostile wall so that the many may become one heart, one family, one new humanity. For God, who is love, and Christ, who is all in all, show no partiality and make no distinction. So neither race nor class, gender nor sexuality, politics or religion, personality nor nationality count for us or against us. The light of Christ enlightens us all. Christ the prisoner and the naked, Christ the hungry and the sick, Christ the thirsty and the stranger, Christ the other. May God's Spirit hover over our chaos, our hatred and indifference. Descend in our hearts with love and pleasure, blow us out into the world to listen and serve, and set us ablaze to forgive and reconcile, for we are all welcome at the table of God. We celebrate this with real food to join around tables, every person, adult and child.
We are continuing our sermon series on the stations of the cross. And today we're talking about condemnation and mockery. If you look now at Scott the painter's depiction of condemnation and mockery, we're walking through these stations of the cross as we make the pathway from Gethsemane, where Jesus was betrayed and arrested, and now we're making our way to the courts and then eventually to the cross. So if you take a moment and look at these two depictions of mockery and condemnation. This is a story of a kangaroo court. And for those that don't know what a kangaroo court is, I looked it up online to help us understand and have a clear idea of what the term might mean. It's basically an unofficial court held by a group of people that are trying to maybe skew an outcome without good evidence, maybe without a good trial. The crime is basically said to be guilty first and then prove your innocence, kind of in a backwards fashion. But it's a mock court without the principles of law and justice put in place, maybe even disregarded and perverted. So this is a kangaroo type of court with Jesus. It's a kind of a scam, a mockery, maybe just a false or a fake depiction or a fake idea that didn't follow the Jewish law back in the day. Some people say that it was completely irresponsible and unauthorized in its fashion. But what we know is it happened, and this happened in a way that basically sets the stage for the cross and lends itself to okay, Jesus was unfairly, I guess the conclusion you could say was unfairly tried. The whole justice system in Israel was set up in a very systematic and methodical way. And this court, this kangaroo court, was done in a very reverse way, breaking almost 18 of the Mosaic laws. So it was basically set up to kill Jesus because that's what they wanted to do. And I have to ask the question, why did they want to kill Jesus? Why did they want to murder Jesus? He didn't do anything wrong. Well, the Bible tells us that when Jesus went into the temple and cleared the temple, remember the flipping of the tables and clearing the temple, or saying, I'm going to tear down this temple and raise it up in 3 days. Things like this aggravated Pharisees. They aggravated the religious leaders of the law. Basically, when Jesus was saying these things, he was putting himself over or in authority over the religious timbre or the religious law of the day, rhythm and law. So like the Sabbath, the rhythm was to rest on the Sabbath day. So when Jesus healed on the Sabbath day, that also made the Pharisees very upset. Blasphemous types of things were said or were said about it, disobeying the 10 Commandments. So not only are we clearing the temple, but and that's our sacred space, but now we're just breaking down the Jewish rhythm because they were very meticulous about how they kept the Sabbath and their traditions. So in Matthew 23, we see that Jesus is also saying things to the religious leaders of the law that were woe to you, woe to you, woe to them, basically upsetting them, calling them wicked. How could you be wicked if you're a meticulous keeper of the law? So the vengeance against Jesus begins to build. So not only do we clear the temple, this sacred space, not only do we break rhythms, we're calling you names, but I would say that probably the biggest reason was they were just envious. They were jealous of Jesus and his followership and his followers. They were definitely jealous of Jesus and how much fame he had, that began to scare people in a sense that, women and children and men and old and young begin to follow Jesus, where a large following group could basically turn into a mass hysteria, overthrowing the Jewish type systems. And then eventually, I would venture to say that the Romans would be upset about that too, because if you're crowning somebody king, that no one is king except Caesar. So Caiaphas in John 11:48 is a high priest, and basically Caiaphas is the one that said that Jesus was going to come and overthrow the Jewish nation and eventually the Roman government, taking away both their place and their nation. And so Caiaphas is the one that, if you're going to crown him king, if he's going to be king, the Romans are going to destroy us as a people. They're going to kill all of us. And so the Jewish leaders began to set their sights against Jesus and coming up with a plan of how we are going to take care of this popular figure, this person that is gaining lots of traction in our community. So Matthew 26:57 says this all the way to 68. Those who arrested Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest. The legal experts and elders had gathered there. Peter followed him from a distance until he came to the high priest's courtyard. He entered that area and sat outside with the officers to see how it would turn out. The chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they could put him to death. They didn't find anything they could use from the many false witnesses who were willing to come forward. But finally they found two who said, "This man said, I can destroy God's temple and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood and said to Jesus, "Aren't you going to respond to the testimony these people have brought against you?" But Jesus was silent. The high priest said, "By the living God, I demand that you tell us whether you are the Christ, God's Son." "You said it," Jesus replied, "but I say to you that from now on you'll see the human one sitting on the right side of the Almighty and coming on the heavenly clouds." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He's insulting God. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, you've heard his insults against God. What do you think?" And they answered, "He deserves to die." Then they spit on his face and beat him. They hit him and said, "Prophesy for us, Christ, who hit you?" So this court was not convened for justice in any way. This court was convened for basically a mockery of the whole system and a scam and a plot to kill Jesus. There was a legal process in the Jewish day, and they did not follow that process. And so first, essentially, Jesus would have gone to Jewish judgment and then to Roman judgment. So first, he's tried in a Jewish context, but because Jews couldn't perform capital punishment, then he would go to the Roman government. Jews had their laws and their system because they were a vassal state. They were a state within the government. So they were ruled by the Romans. They couldn't rule themselves. That's why they paid taxes to Caesar. So they were a state within a nation or a Roman system, and they wanted Jesus killed. So there was a certain way to do that. There was like steps that they needed to take. And so first there was basically two judgments where Jesus would have been judged by the Jewish people, like let's say in the temple halls. That's how basically people were judged. And then they went before the governors and before the leaders of the pockets of the Roman government. By the time you got to the Roman government, it was probably, as I read different historical accounts of capital punishment, it was just get rid of these people, like wash my hands. I don't want to deal with this. But if they tried somebody wrong, they could actually be held accountable for that. And if it created more of an uprising, that that specific leader of that certain region could have been held accountable, killed themselves. So it was a serious series of judgments. But in the Jewish system, there was basically two judgments we read here, where Jesus is first sent to Annas and his house, or Caiaphas and his house, but Annas was there for a pretrial, and then Caiaphas. So we have Annas and Caiaphas, and then appearing before the Sanhedrin, which is the gathering of the 70 elders, or the leaders that are officially in charge of the Jewish court. So you have Jewish judgment, and then sent to Roman judgment before Pilate, and then Pilate sends it to Herod, and then Herod kicks it back then to Pilate, and Pilate wanted to wash his hands of it, so he sends it to Herod according to Luke's gospel, and then Herod sends him back to Pilate. So today we look at, I guess, the Jewish judgment, and we're stopped there. We're not going to go into the record of all of the other yet, but this is recorded for us in Matthew, and that's where we're going to stay, is in the Jewish judgment. If I jump forward to John 18, there's a little more detail here in verse 12, where it says, "Then the company of soldiers, the commander, and the guards from the Jewish leaders took Jesus into custody. They bound him and led him first to Annas. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it was better for one person to die for all the people." So Caiaphas is the one that said, let this guy die because they're going to destroy our nation. So Annas actually has a lot of power. He's no longer the high priest, but of course, the high priest position is a powerful position. It is a very lucrative job. So just because you step down doesn't mean you don't have your hands in what's happening and holding the strings. So Annas holds the strings. Jesus is brought before Annas, and the Bible gives this commentary about how Caiaphas is speaking into the situation. Let's get rid of Jesus because he's going to destroy our nation. So Annas agrees with the son-in-law, basically, and now Jesus appears and is questioned, and his disciples and his teaching is questioned. I want you to notice here that Annas is questioning Jesus without charge. So there's actually no charge here against Jesus. He's just now being questioned and provoked, or trying to be provoked in this situation. So in John 18, it says, "Meanwhile, the chief priests questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered, 'I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews gather. I've said nothing in private. Why ask me? Ask those who heard what I told them. They know what I said.' After Jesus spoke, one of the guards standing there slapped Jesus in the face. 'Is that how you would answer the high priest?' he asked." So Jesus is faced with questions. He's faced with his intention, and he comes out and he says, I've been very open about what I've talked about. I've said it in public. There's nothing to hide, and there's nothing that I'm doing in secret. What's interesting, usually in a court of law, is you appear before a judge and you've been accused. But in this case, he's appearing before the judge that is accusing. So it's in a sense backwards. And so he's using this method of, I've been open about this. As you're accusing me in private, all things that I've said and done have been in public. And so what they've done, or what he said there in front of the high priest, resulted in spitting or striking him and slapping him, taking the opportunity basically to break Jesus. Basically what I see here is they're giving him the opportunity or an out, and he doesn't take that opportunity. They're basically saying, all you have to do is just not say you're the Son of God, or just move on or something. But he doesn't take that opportunity. So I'm no lawyer, and I've not been legally trained. I understand some things about our justice system and the basic principles and procedures and things that I learned in college and stuff, and since just reading and learning about legal sentencing. I understand that trials, we conduct trials in public. Usually it's not done usually in a small group of people. There's witnesses there. There's openness to ensure fairness. The accused have a right to defend themselves. They can bring along an attorney and a representative or a counsel to help them to defend them. There needs to be reliable witnesses. Those witnesses are vetted. They are held to a high degree of accountability. They're sworn in and things like that. There needs to be charges brought to the person. There's just not, people just don't like show up to court for no reason. And courts are held in the daytime. I don't want to be anachronistic with this and just impose our system on their system, but there's a lot of similarities that have never changed when it comes to court proceedings. So this trial of Jesus is a capital trial, and the crimes that he's been accused of are punishable by death according to that ancient Jewish system. And Jesus and his trial break, like I said before in the very beginning, 18 of the Mosaic laws that are meant to protect the accused. And so here are some of the things that were broken. So the testimony of an accomplice was not allowed. And that's the first idea. But then also the accused could not be questioned by a private individual. So Christ is taken to Annas, and we have the Caiaphas' father-in-law and the former high priest, and then to Caiaphas. So he's being accused by a private individual. No legal proceedings could take place at night, and so this was taking place at night. The Jewish judges, the Sanhedrin, could not bring charges. Witnesses had to do that, or a group of people had to do that, and so they brought false witnesses to the table. This is something interesting. Capital offenses cannot be tried on a preparation day for the Sabbath or a holy day like the Passover, and the Passover was beginning the next evening, so this couldn't have even been held that night. Capital trials had to last more than a day to allow for like a vetting process or a greater consideration and for more people to come forward. There had to be 2 or 3 agreeing witnesses, and they had to cast the first stones at the criminals. And so if the witnesses were untruthful, they received the capital punishment themselves. So the idea of perjury was a capital offense in and of itself. No one can accuse himself. And so Jesus agreed that he was who he claimed to be. So there's a nuance there. The high priest could not grandstand. And so Caiaphas ripped his clothes and accused Christ of blasphemy. The accused must have been given ample time to defend themselves with the accusations. And if with a capital crime, the decision is unanimous against the accused, then the case was thrown out. So if you had a unanimous vote without any question, the case was actually thrown out. You had bribery going on. You had the Sanhedrin convened in an improper place, and then they went to a proper place to try to make it all look legal. So this was all why Pilate and Herod, they were questioning what was happening because they knew these court proceedings. They weren't like kept in the dark about this kind of stuff, and they didn't know what to do with Jesus because they looked at the situation and said, this is not the way that this is supposed to go down. So that's all the semantics of the court proceedings. That's how it went down in Matthew, and some of the other gospels give some different details that I thought were important. But I think the most important line in this trial was not the semantics of the trial. We know that was a kangaroo court. We know it was a mockery. We know it was a, can't win type of situation. But right in the middle of this passage, in Matthew 26:63, it says this, but Jesus was silent. Jesus was silent. And I asked myself, why is that in there? Because when things are put in on purpose, they definitely do bring emphasis to the situation. And silence in our modern times, what we think of silence, I plead the fifth, right? That usually automatically implies guilt. Yet I think Jesus portrays something very different in his silence. And so right before this, Jesus says in the garden, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And then asking rhetorically, basically, do you think that I cannot call on God and he will once put all at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels to take care of this? So right before this, Jesus basically says, put down the sword. The fight is not worth it. Put down the fight. Jesus could have fought. Jesus could have defended himself. Jesus could have just argued whatever he wanted to do with that. But Jesus chose silence. So this goes along with his ministry, that Jesus chooses silence over fights. That Jesus chooses silence over fights. And his ministry as a whole, turn the other cheek, give your jacket to somebody who steals, things like that were said along the way, that Jesus chose silence, basically, could I say, over war, that Jesus chose to be quiet over the fight. But also this silence means something very profound, that Jesus chose silence to show sacrifice, that he was willing, the message of forgiveness and sacrifice, of life unto death, that he was willing to go to the cross. So it shows a willingness, it conveys a willingness in Jesus and his posture. They call this the divine silence, because that's the posture of sacrifice that for me, he could have had a vigorous self-defense. It's the blame shifting or finger pointing, that accusations back, but he chose to have divine silence. And this is an example for me that when I get accused or finger pointed or blamed for something that I feel like I was innocent over, that the divine silence, I can engage the divine silence. Blame shifting is not necessary. Some vigorous self-defense is not necessary. If I have integrity, my integrity most often will stand firm. And it's not necessary to engage in the fight. Silence over fight. Jesus chooses this silence for sacrifice. But this was written down by someone. And the author of Matthew included this very specifically for us to capture our attention. And the writer of Matthew puts this in on purpose. It wasn't on accident that silence is included at this moment. In Hebrew culture or Hebrew writing, when silence is written in, or when a story is told and silence happens, whether it be in a spoken realm or in a written realm, silence is a form of drama. It actually is put here to quiet us, to make us pay attention to something. And what is that something? Something important is about to happen. And this is something important for me when I read this, that sometimes I gloss over these small things. This small little inclusion of silence tells me that the Christ story, the cross, is a very, very important event. When this is included at this point in Hebrew writing, this actually tells me that this is the most important event of all of Christ's life. And the silence, the divine silence, is included here to get me to look at it very, very closely. And this is why I love the Stations of the Cross, because this is a time in our lives every year that we get to walk through the road from the garden to the cross, where we move with Jesus and we follow Jesus and take the posture of Jesus. and we get to reenact or to feel and perceive and look at the nuances of the passion. And the cross and the resurrection is what makes Christianity Christianity. And without the resurrection, without the cross and the resurrection, we just have another like philosophy. But with the cross and the resurrection, we now have God. We now have Jesus, God incarnate, God with us. So what do I learn from this? I think that we all can learn something from Jesus and his silence, that when we are being mocked, condemned, and accused, silence is better. When we're being, finger pointed and blamed, silence is better. To gather our thoughts. When we have stimulus, boom, something happens. We pause, silence, and then respond. And we're going to see Jesus and his response coming up next week.
Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 26, I received a tradition from the Lord, which I also handed on to you. On the night on which he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread. After giving thanks, he broke it and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this to remember me. He did the same thing with the cup, after they had eaten, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Every time you drink it, do this to remember me. Every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you broadcast the death of the Lord until he comes. When we gather together, we remember Jesus through the act of communion. Communion gives the idea of togetherness. All around the world, every day, believers and searchers perform communion. It's a simple act. It's just bread and wine. But it is in the pause, remembering, and thanksgiving that our hearts are turned outward to others. Communion is for all. No matter where you are at on your faith journey, the table is open for you. All that is required from us is that we have a truthful conversation of where our hearts are at. Jesus knows us, our deepest and darkest and brightest, and we are all invited to communion. So take the bread, dip it into the juice. We remember the sacrifice of Jesus and the reason we are here today. Take and eat. And we say thanks be to God.